So as part of the Cathedral Quarter project here in Westgate Street, we've been working on the former Meeks Shoe shop. So everybody remembers Meeks coming to get their school shoes here when they were little. It's a really amazing building. It's a Grade 2 star listed building, which possibly people wouldn't realise, it just being a shoe shop. But it is very significant. 16th century range at the back that sort of sides onto St John's Lane. And then at the front of the building, there's a new section, which is a Georgian part of the building. But the older section is really sort of the important bit and what makes it 2-star, because it has an amazing ceiling, which was put in probably, originally the timber work would have been there from the 15th century, 16th century when that block was built, and it would originally have jetted out into St John's Lane. And then at some point, sort of shortly after that, so we think sort of late 1500s, early 1600s, a really fantastic, significant plaster ceiling was put in there. It's highly decorative and it shows sort of heraldic symbols. It's got things that we think represent the 4 countries of the UK. So we've got a fleur-de-lis, which possibly represents Wales. We've got roses, we've got thistles. And also on the chimney breast, there's a really fantastic frieze on there, which has a section for a coat of arms, which sadly is gone, but possibly would have been painted on there. And then to either side of that, we've got some amazing characters. They look like ladies from the Americas possibly, or from the Indies. And it just shows really, I think, that the people who lived there were quite high status people. And that's really why the building is Grade 2 star listed. So as part of this project, we've been working on it with the owner. We've obviously consolidated that plaster ceiling. It had been previously repaired in the early 2000s, but had a little bit of cracking and a little bit of movement. So we've had specialist contractors, Hales and Howe, come along, and they've looked at it. They've gone above into the attic space and looked how it's been repaired before and how they can repair it this time. And really, there's wasn't a huge amount of work to be done, but just a little bit of consolidating the plaster work with new plaster, pinning it from above with some metal pins to stop it from collapsing where it was starting to come away from the laths behind, and then just putting a small coat of plaster over the top of it, and then painting the whole thing with a lime-based distemper, which really brings it back to life and makes it look fantastic. So as part of the project, we've obviously done a lot of work to the facade as well. It was in a pretty poor state. The brickwork is quite significant really, because it's a Georgian facade. When people were building in the Georgian times, they were quite keen to get that classical look. A lot of Georgian buildings of sort of status were built of stone, and when you imagine a stone building, you can't really see the joins. The joins are very narrow. And when people started building in brick, they wanted to sort of replicate that with their brickwork, and of course brick edges can be a little bit rough. So the method of making that look much more neat and tidy and much more in keeping with that Georgian style is to do something called tuck pointing. So basically you rake out the joint, you put mortar in there that sort of matches the colour of the brick, so you get like a uniform appearance to the brick, and then you kind of carve out a little line and put your different colour mortar in. So basically it's a bit of trompe l'oeil really, because it makes the bricks look like very neat and tidy bits of work, but actually you're disguising those rough edges and making those mortar lines look very, very neat and tidy. We had an amazing contractor do that for us, who's very skilled in this, and it's quite an art to do, but really interesting and good to see that happen on this building.
My name's Corinne Jackal, and I'm here doing some line conservation on the facade of the building. Here we've got an example of tuck pointing where the brickwork is worn away and they filled it with a red mortar in between the joints, and then scored in a groove, which you can see behind this bit, and then filled it with a black mortar on top to make it look nice and neat and nice fine joints. Used a lot when the bricks aren't particularly good quality, so that you can make it look like a really neat, fine, tightly jointed building. But yeah, so now I'm just filling in with the red mortar over the joints. You can do this quite easily, you don't have to worry too much about going over the surface, because you've got to fill it quite full. This is a hydraulic lime mortar with red sand, brick dust, a little bit of coal dust, and a little bit of red ochre pigment as well.
So what does the coal dust do?
Just darkens it down, because lime always goes pink.
Yeah.
So anything you can do to bring the colours down. It's sort of
So is tuck pointing different to any other type of pointing?
it involves the same techniques, really. The only, I mean, originally they would have just scored in the black lines on really long strings and whatever, but because I'm just patching in, so once you've got the red in, you then scrape it back so that it's flush with the brickwork. As flush as you can. I haven't sieved the lime because in this bit you can see all the little white speckles in the original. So I'm trying to there will be white speckles coming through the new.
What's the white speckles?
It's just the bits of unslaked lime or lime at the left. I'm going to scrape that back.
So is this a very common technique in Gloucester?
No, it's quite rare in Gloucester because most bricks are quite well done. If you see the neighbouring buildings, they're they're quite modern. A lot of it was timber framed and rendered anyway. So there's not many old bricks buildings, facades left. So I'll see that one. Yeah, it's quite rare. Anyway, a bit of a mess.
How long do you think it will take you to do this section of wall?
It will take me probably a day to do. Yeah, kind of done the first lift. Yes.
So it's quite delicate work.
Yeah, it's quite just a bit painstaking really. Once you got it to that stage, because I'm a bit damp, I will sponge it a bit to get rid of the bloom off the bricks. Sponge it off the face of the brick. On the original you can see grooves where the black was then inserted, so they scored the red point in mix and then put the black on top, so that's basically what I'm going to do. Just to a depth of about, I don't know, 2-3 mil, not even. Give that a few minutes.
So as well as Hales and Howe working on the plaster ceiling, they also worked on replastering the chimney breast there. This was a bit of a tricky one because the original plasterwork had kind of broken away at a lower level and the chimney had had a bit of work done to it over time. There was some original plaster left at the bottom of the chimney, but When they looked at that, it was actually really loose and it wasn't possible to salvage it, unfortunately, but they have salvaged some little sections where they could. And really the approach with that was to try and put back plaster that would have been there, but then also plaster inside the chimney to make it look a bit neater and tidier. And the decision was taken then that we would put a bit of a dado rail across the top of where the sort of fireplace surround would have been. We've put a little dado rail there to sort of break the thicker layer of plaster with a thinner layer that then feathers into the original plasterwork.
So we have knocked all of the original render or lime render off, saving what we could, which is this little piece here and this little piece there. And the original lime, although it was on with horsehair or hair of some description, it was so thin it was not savable, so it's all come off. Then we have dampened down the stonework and given it a good dampening down.
Is that just with water? Or?
Just with water, absolutely no chemicals. Dampened it down with water, and then we've used haired or fibred backing coat for the scratch coat, and then we've used haired and fibred lime for the float coat, and I am currently applying the top coat. The first coat is a stiffer, harder coat that we've put on there, and that sticks to the stonework. It evens out the suction, and it gives it gives the float coat a good bond, something nice and hard to stick to. So the scratch coat's just to give it a nice even suction and to give you, it's your base coat for all the subsequent coats. So it needs to be a stronger mix, you know, it's a bit of a harder mix. Float coat is exactly the same material, and we use fibres in all of our coat to reduce the cracking. It's exactly the same material, and the floating coat is to level it out. So although this is a very old chimney and it's all over the place, lots of undulation and that, you just use the float coat to level it out and bring it to roughly where it needs to go, so that when you apply a thin top coat, which is applied in 2 mil, not much more than that. You want the top coat to be as flat as possible, so you have a nice finish on it, and then so you use the floating coat to get that where it needs to go. So the scratch coat is just to give you a good bond and even the suction. The float coat is to flatten it, to take top coat.
So how long has the process been? Because it sounds, obviously you can't do it all in one go, can you?
No, this process has gone on for a couple of months, so you need to allow a good 3 weeks between each coat for it to carbonate, so it draws in from the atmosphere to go harder, and you need to give it 3 weeks between each coat, and that's exactly what we've done. This is why 2 months later I'm still here. But so that's it. And as I say, we've just left these bits exposed.
Yeah, just to give a sort of a glimpse of the original.
Yeah.
But you're protecting it for the long term.
Exactly. Yeah.
So now that all this work has been undertaken on Meeks Shoes, the idea now is that the building is basically out for rental. So the upper floors were vacant previously. The first floor had been used for storing the shoes for the shoe shop, but the upper 2 floors have been converted into flats. So they're really lovely, big Georgian flats, lovely Georgian windows, big spaces. So they're now available to rent, and also the shop unit is available to rent. So we've managed to get a vacant floor space back into use, and we've created a much neater, tidier shop unit for anyone looking to have a business on Westgate Street, along with this amazing shop front that's been put back. Obviously the shop front that was here originally, people will remember from their childhood, but it wasn't really in keeping with the Georgian style of the building. So we've put a much more appropriate shop front back on the front of the building, and that really makes the building sing now as part of the heritage of this beautiful Westgate Street.